Okay, going into chapter 2, which is second language learning, getting away from first language learning, I just want to say a few things about the chapter here, about the from pages 35 to 40. I'll do the first video, and we're just trying to figure out, the knowledge and use of the new language, the knowledge that the student has, but obviously really being able to use it. And of course, learning first language and second language, one thing is that the context is so different. Obviously, when you learn first language, you're a baby and you're with this family or this society, just speaking your language. You have no other language, no first language. And obviously, when you learn a second language, well, there's different descriptions of second language learners, which are important. For example, if you have a child learning a second language, let's say a child has immigrated with their family, so they're here, they're learning English in preschool or daycare or just living in this country, then that's one situation. And obviously those are going to be great language learners. But more commonly, you get a teenager in another country studying English as a foreign language, and that's where it gets really hard because it's just one of their classes. They're only in there a few hours a week, and a lot of times, in fact, they have bad experiences trying to learn a foreign language. One thing that's interesting is that a lot of really good students in other types of classes have difficulty in a foreign language class because it's such a different type of learning. It's not about memorizing and just having a good memory or working hard. And vice versa. You'll have students who don't do real well in typical classes in high school, but they're real strong in foreign language class because they're able to pick up that skill. Or maybe they have that cultural interest, or maybe they're very personal people. Whatever the reason, it's frustrating for especially the real scientific type of student who finds him or herself sort of unable to memorize English. And then there's the third type of person, what we call like the adult learner or adult education, where you usually have an adult from another country who's working here. They need to learn English, and a lot of times they're just working, but not really in class as much. And that's as you can imagine, a very tough situation. Sometimes, at home they're speaking their first language, and then at work they're speaking English, or out in the community. And those students often what we call fossilize, which means, after 10, 15, 20 years, they seem to still have a heavy accent or still make basic grammatical mistakes because they've been here so long and they've kind of given up. As long as people understand them, they seem to just keep going. And we'll talk more about that later because actually having an accent is not necessarily as big a problem as you might think in terms of communicating in a foreign country. In fact, some people even like your foreign accent because they think it's interesting or cute. So sometimes, it can work for you, or it can work against you if people don't give you that job or discriminate against you or feel like you're not assimilating to the culture or something like that. And obviously there's different stages, beginning, intermediate, advanced, but we're more interested in these sequences of learning. We're more interested, in a way, as we teach English, we kind of want to know, instead of just teaching simple to complex, we're interested in how, we can see first language learners, we can see the order that the sequence that they tend to learn, like ing, like walking, or ed ending for past tense, or how long it takes them to learn how to use the versus a correctly. And we want to know if there's some sort of natural sequence, we can use that to develop our English courses as well. So we're looking for those sequences. Syntax refers to grammar. You may not have heard that term a lot. And then morphology might be a new linguistic term. Morphology has to do with the parts of words that have meaning. Could be the root, like bio, but it could also be a prefix like ex or anti, and it could even be a grammatical morpheme like plural s. So when I say two cars, that s means plural, and that's also called a morpheme. Obviously, vocabulary is one of the key things that we talk a lot about: building your vocabulary, building your grammar, and then pronunciation, which is called phonology in linguistics. And then there's another area called pragmatics, which is not talked about as much, but pragmatics has to do with being able to really use that language appropriately and politely, and the kind of subtleties of language, really not just knowing these words and phrases, but really knowing the culture. And that would even include body language, the nonverbal communication, or even sarcasm, humor. Humor is also connected very much with pragmatics, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And it's just kind of strange because when we learn a foreign language, we know how language works because we already know one language, but it doesn't seem to help us necessarily learn this foreign language just because we know, I know I have to learn spelling, I have to learn the writing system, I have to learn words, grammar, word order. But even though we know what to do, it still makes that skill is still kind of going to be difficult. I like to think about, if you always write with your right hand, then it's so hard to write with your left hand. Even though you know exactly how to write, you're not used to using your left hand. So you write like a child with your left hand. And it seems strange because you know how to write, but again, language as not as a knowledge, but as this skill that you've practiced and worked out, like musical instruments and sports and fixing cars and all of those type of skill-based type activities. And also another thing we're interested in is when a student makes an error or a mistake, we want to analyze that to say, why are they making that mistake? Is it because it's different in their language than English? Or is it just because it's something they haven't learned in English yet? Is it the same type of mistake like we make as kids when we learn English? Or is it a totally different type of mistake that only a person like from French would make, or from Chinese, or from Arabic? And we can identify it as sort of a language-specific error. We call that interference. Interference or interlingual errors are specifically when you're confusing the two languages. But intralingual, with an A, intralingual errors are just errors that native speakers make when they're learning the language as well. It's totally like, for example, if I say, I walk, he walks, but if I say, I walk, he walk, it's nothing to do with my first language necessarily, but it's probably just because in English we have this strange rule that we add s to third person singular nouns, and so that makes it would be an intralingual error. Other factors like anxiety, we believe adults have a lot more anxiety than children. They're afraid to make mistakes, or they don't want to look silly. But when you're a child, you seem to have this flexibility, and you seem to be more open and willing, I guess, to make mistakes. Some people believe that there's a silent period for children. When we learn our first language, there's this silent period where for one or 2 years we're not really speaking a lot, but we're listening. Some people believe that when you learn a foreign language, maybe if you were not pushed to start speaking right away, it might benefit you. When we learn foreign languages, we like to start speaking right away. And also another in this area is we have formal language versus informal language. Textbook, sometimes like textbook English versus the real world type English. And there's a term for that which is not in our book, which you might hear BICS versus CALP. And BICS is BICS, which is the basic interpersonal communication skills. There's just the ability for small talk and everyday language. But then for college, you've got this CALP, C-A-L-P, Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency, which is that academic language that you need, like to survive in a classroom and study, study in a university. Another interesting aspect of this is sometimes when people learn a foreign language, they like to find children's books, or even like books for maybe young teenagers, so that they get that sort of simplified input or reading that can get them through. Obviously, when we learn a foreign language, the teacher slows down and speaks this teacher speak, and that's useful and that works. There's kind of a joke that as an ESL teacher, there's a joke that, even after work we go home and we speak to our spouse or we speak to our kids in this very simplified ESLese language, and we can't really stop it sometimes.